There is a notched wooden rod leaning against the wall of a house that no longer exists, a surveyor's tool meant to mark the distance between what was promised and what was lost. We stand in that gap today, looking at a horizon that has stayed empty for so long we've begun to mistake the silence for an answer. The prophet is told to speak tenderly, to cry out that the hard service is over, but the ground beneath our feet is still nothing but sand and stone. How do you prepare a highway for a king when you no longer have the strength to stand? In the beginning of the exile, the cry wasn't for power, but for a voice in the waste. Jerusalem sat in the dust, her walls leveled, her temple a memory, and the word came, "Comfort, comfort my people." It is a command given to the heavens to be delivered to the earth. But look at the requirement. Every valley must be raised, every mountain made low. The geometry of the world must shift before the glory appears. It started there, in the realization that the distance between us and the Creator wasn't a matter of miles, but of terrain we had no tools to level. The voice in the wilderness does not ask for a volunteer, it issues a decree. Make straight in the desert a highway for our God. We look at our own lives and see the jagged peaks of pride and the deep dark trenches of hidden failures. We imagine we are the ones who must take up the shovel and the pickaxe to make the path smooth enough for Him to walk toward us. Yet the text suggests the mountains don't move because we climb them. They move because the mouth of the Lord has spoken. There is a sudden, sharp turn in the message. The prophet asks what he should cry, and the answer is a cold bucket of water to the soul. All people are like grass. We spend our lives trying to build something that lasts, trying to be the oaks of righteousness, but the breath of the Lord blows and the flowers fall. It is an unsettling truth to realize that our faithfulness, the very thing we thought would bridge the gap, is as seasonal as the meadow weeds. If the grass withers when He breathes, what hope is there for the highway? The notched wooden rod is held up against the height of a man and then against the span of a life. It is too short for both. If we are merely grass that wilts in the heat of His presence, why would the Eternal One bother to carve a road through our desert? The messenger is told to go up on a high mountain and lift up a voice without fear. Here is your God. But the God who arrives is not a peer. He is the one who has measured the waters in the hollow of His hand. Think of that, every ocean, every tear, every drop of rain held in the curve of a single palm. He marks off the heavens with the span of His hand, as if the entire universe were nothing more than the distance between a thumb and a pinky finger. We see the scale now. The nations are a drop in a bucket. The islands are fine dust. We worry about the movements of empires and the shifting of global powers, but to Him they are regarded as less than nothing. The wood that will not rot, the gold overlaid by the smith. It is all a frantic attempt to create a God that can be measured by our own tools. We want a God who fits the notches on our wooden rod, but He sits enthroned above the circle of the earth, and the rulers of this world are like grasshoppers. There is a terror in this kind of sovereignty. No sooner are the princes planted, no sooner do they take root, than He blows on them and they wither. A whirlwind sweeps them away like chaff. We realize that the hard service mentioned at the start wasn't just about a physical exile in Babylon. It was the exhaustion of trying to find an equal to the Holy One. To whom will you compare Him? Who was His counselor? Who taught in the path of understanding? The heavens are stretched out like a canopy, a tent to live in, and He calls the starry host one by one. Not one is missing because of His great power. And yet, in the middle of this cosmic display, a complaint rises from the dust. My way is hidden from the Lord, says the weary heart. My cause is disregarded by my God. We feel the weight of a Creator who is too big to see the individual blade of grass, a God whose understanding is so deep it must surely be indifferent to our shallow pains. That notched wooden rod, you've been holding it so long your palm is cramped. You've used it to measure the depth of your exhaustion and the height of the walls that won't move. But look at the wood in the light of this glory. It was never meant to measure Him. It was meant to show you that you have run out of notches. Do you not know? Have you not heard? The questions aren't rebukes, they are invitations to look past the wilting grass. The Lord is the everlasting God, the Creator of the ends of the earth. He will not grow tired. He will not grow weary. The source of all things does not have a battery that drains or a resolve that falters. He gives strength to the weary and increases the power of the weak, not by giving them a better tool, but by giving them his own arm. Even the youths grow tired. The young men, in the prime of their natural strength, stumble and fall. The wooden rod snaps when the weight of the world is pressed against it. But there is a different kind of rising promised here. Not a climb up a mountain we leveled ourselves, but a soaring on wings like eagles, to run and not grow weary, to walk and not be faint. It is the impossible physics of a life fueled by a fire that does not consume itself. The surveyor has left the rod behind because the city being built has no boundaries. He didn't come to help you finish the highway. He came to be the highway. He gathers the lambs in his arms, the same arms that marked the heavens, and he carries them close to his heart. You aren't waiting for the strength to reach him. You are being held by the strength that reached for you. When you finally stop measuring the desert, will you have the courage to let him carry you across it?